Hello, and thank you for joining us again for today's episode of the Reminger Report podcast on emerging technologies. Today, Zach and I are going to be beginning a discussion that'll cover the next few episodes at least on cryptocurrency and issues related to cryptocurrency. And before we fully dive into some of the nuances of this subject, it's probably going to be helpful if we can talk a little bit about some of the basics of cryptocurrency, some of the terms we see commonly, and what those terms mean. So, Zach, one of the words we hear thrown around a lot, and it's referenced in changing all types of technology, is the blockchain. The blockchain is going to change everything. What is the blockchain?
Sure. So when we talk about the blockchain, the technical terms that are commonly associated with this is something called a distributed ledger. Now, when we kind of break those two words apart, I think it's helpful to separate them because, from a fundamental standpoint, we have an understanding as to what it means to be distributed, and then I think the other term we could use is decentralized. And then the other term is ledger, right? And so a ledger is essentially what we commonly would think about what a ledger is, right? It's like an accounting almost, right? It is an account or a tracking of various transactions. And so I think whenever I think of the term ledger, for some reason I think of um, the old Christmas Carol with Scrooge, who is in the old bank, and I think of the account books, and I think of them entering all the transactions in a ledger, right? Because he was an accounting house or he was a financial institution, and so I think of a ledger in that sense of a book that's where transactions are being recorded. So the ledger part is simply just a manner in which transactions are recorded. The distributed nature of this is the fact that it's not stored in one place or one location. And so when you think of a traditional ledger, the Christmas Carol that I was just telling you about, you're thinking of the fact that there is a physical book located in one specific location, and there's one, right? There's one master copy. Now, the distributed ledger is not a single copy, and it's not centrally located. And so what it is there are multiple copies of this transaction that are kept across multiple locations. And there is no one location where they're kept. It's decentralized, meaning that multiple people will have access and be able to check the transaction, and it's not kept in a single location. It may be kept in multiple places within the blockchain technology. And so the idea behind all of this is that the blockchain makes it harder to forge transactions or to have fraudulent transactions, because all of the transactions are supposed to be able to be they're stored on the ledger. They're not in one central location, which means even if you were to affect a transaction on one ledger, there would still be the same transactions recorded in other places. And so it's harder to have a fraudulent transaction. And the fact that it's decentralized means that multiple people or multiple entities can be involved in ensuring the accuracy of that blockchain.
So, thanks for going through that. I think we'll have some understanding of what the blockchain is, but what is it used for? What's the function of this blockchain technology?
And so I will tell you that when we think of blockchain from a pop culture reference, we see the term blockchain used almost interchangeably with cryptocurrency, right? And so oftentimes when people see the term blockchain, they immediately think Bitcoin, right? Or they think Ethereum, or they think Ripple, or they think Dogecoin, right? There's any number of cryptocurrencies that utilize the blockchain technology in some form or capacity. And so, but frankly, and I'm not suggesting to you that blockchain isn't used in those cryptocurrencies or in that capacity, but the blockchain technology itself, limiting it to the cryptocurrency, undersells like what it's actually capable of. That for like a public use, that's where we see it being used in the general public a lot. But there's also a corresponding um, private use. And sometimes it's actually public entities who are using it, but there's almost a private use for it that is also incredibly valuable. So we have started to see certain foreign nations start to record or attempt to record land transfers using blockchain technology. The idea being that instead of simply recording the ownership of, and we talked about the ledger and the decentralization aspect of it, instead of just tracking the ownership of, let's say, an individual Bitcoin, you can, which is an intangible asset. You can also track the ownership of a tangible asset, right? And you think of a parcel of land, right? Now, here in the United States, the vast majority of the way that we record and track land ownership is, frankly, pretty much the same way we've been tracking them since the founding of our country, if not, the colonies. And that is there's usually a county recorder or some other government entity where deeds and mortgages and other legal documents relating to the ownership of property are recorded and tracked. And so if somebody wanted to see who owned, my house, they could go down and track that parcel, and they could go through, and have a history of all the transactions that related to this specific parcel, and they could date it back until it was subdivided from a larger parcel, right? The idea being that that requires all the deeds and all the transactions to be stored essentially in one single location, right? The county recorder's office, which could potentially be subject to some sort of manipulation or fraud. It also requires um, the risk that there's one single location. So if something happens to those records, it risks the fact that we may not know who had ownership of which parcels. And when you date back, you know, well before we had the digital age and cloud computing, there would be stories about like a county recorder's office or a courthouse that caught fire. The land transfer records were all stored in one single location, and now an entire county's land records are burned down, right? And there were no potential duplicate copies of them because it was too time consuming. And so the idea with the blockchain technology is these type of transactions, and it's not just limited to land transfers, right? But it's one of the ones that we think about the easiest. You can use the blockchain technology to help to track these type of transactions. And then you've got a situation where it's not just one entity or person who maintains the records, it's multiple. But you're able to track it better, and hopefully, right, that the thought process is um, it would help to avoid fraud and help to make the records more accurate.
That is certainly an interesting potential, and I think some law students would give them some interesting facts to work with for property exams. But you mentioned another term in talking about blockchain technology, another term we hear thrown around a lot, and that's cryptocurrency. So what is cryptocurrency? What does that term mean when we hear people talking about investing in crypto or the blockchain in cryptocurrency? What is cryptocurrency?
Yeah. So when we think about cryptocurrency, in a broad sense, and I will tell you that part of the problem with even answering this question is that there are so many different forms of cryptocurrency now. And I don't just mean the sheer number of them, but there's also ones that function differently in different respects. And each one of them is designed, a little bit differently. And so, probably the most prominent one, the one that everybody has probably, I shouldn't say everybody, but the one that people have heard the most about is Bitcoin, right? It was the first one. It was the one that kind of came on the market um, and kind of came to fruition. Now, there's a whole host of other of cryptocurrencies that are used, but the idea is that these essentially coins that are tracked through the blockchain are have some value, right? So I sell my coin to another individual and I can buy, I can sell it, I can trade it. The idea being that it has some value that's attributed to it, usually in US dollars, but sometimes in other currency, that I would be able to sell the coin to and then receive, you know, actual fiat currency like US dollars in exchange. They are generally bought, sold, and traded using the blockchain technology. So the transactions, the transfers of ownership, those are recorded in the blockchain. So you'd be able to track who owns, and not necessarily who owns because but you can track where it goes in the chain technology to help to authenticate and verify it as being part of the blockchain technology. And so, I told you I used the name Bitcoin. I tossed around Ripple was another one. It's slightly different um, in the fact that it's designed not to be decentralized, so it still uses the blockchain technology, but it's hosted by an entity. The idea being that by not being decentralized, it could be more used by financial institutions. That's how it was originally kind of marketed. Um, think of large international banks using it to make wire transfers between, with the idea being that it's either faster or more secure than a traditional wire transfer. There's also new coins, what we call stable coins, and I won't go into great detail, but they haven't always proven to be actually all that stable. But the idea being that they were tied to a currency, meaning one stable coin would be worth one US dollar. I'm just using that as an example. It could be tied to a penny or a quarter, or it could be tied to the Canadian dollar or the British pound. But the idea being that it's got a direct correlation. Um, Now, when we talk about the way in which these bitcoins are actually, or cryptocurrencies, excuse me, are actually stored, one of the things that I think people have an idea about is that there's multiple ways in which you actually can store your currency, right? And so one of the ways is what we call an exchange. And so you think of this as, for example, a stockbroker, an online stockbroker, right? An online stock trading platform, a brokerage. The the exchanges are almost like a brokerage, except for the cryptocurrency. And so instead of trading stock in, let's say, Apple or Tesla, you're trading Bitcoin on an exchange. Now, there's been a number of exchanges that we have seen kind of pop up. We've seen some, Zach Durant, one of our colleagues here at Reminger, did a podcast recently on the FTX exchange and the failure regarding that. But that's the idea of an exchange. And some of the exchanges have been around, a long time. Others have been new flyers, but that's the idea of an exchange. The money and your money or your cryptocurrency is actually stored on the exchange. Now, you contrast that with what we call a hardware wallet, which is where it's not stored on the exchange, but you are storing individual Bitcoins or coins in a hardware wallet. Sometimes it's a flash drive, sometimes it's an external hard drive, sometimes it's on um, a hard drive, right? And you store those individuals. Now these are more secure in the sense that they're less likely to be hacked. There's less likely of a chance that something bad would happen to them. The flip is to this is that sometimes they're harder to gain access to. So we've heard these stories about people who have stored Bitcoin on a computer hard drive, and then the hard drive actually accidentally gets thrown away, right? There was a famous example of a gentleman in the United Kingdom who had millions of dollars on a hard drive and accidentally threw it and is now looking to excavate an entire waste facility site in order to locate the hard drive because it's worth millions and millions of dollars, right? So that's one of the issues and there are companies now who specialize in unlocking locked hardware wallets, right? And so people will forget their passcode, their passkeys, in order to unlock their cryptocurrency wallets they've stored on their hard drive. And there are now companies who specialize in working to help you unlock the wallets. So they're more stable, but they also risk that because they're more stable and more secure, you can actually run the risk of securing yourself out of them.
Yeah, a little bit too secure. So along with cryptocurrency, one of the other acronyms or terms we hear is NFTs. What's an NFT, especially compared to cryptocurrency?
Yeah. So it definitely has similarities in the fact that cryptocurrency is a token, and so NFTs is essentially an acronym for non-fungible tokens. And the idea being is that they've taken a token and they have usually tied it to something visual. I think of like a trading card, or you think of an original piece of art in a digital format, right? And you then tie it into the code, right, that exists for this image. You then tie it to a specific cryptocurrency, right? You tie it to a specific code, so that what it allows it to do is it gives it some value just in the fact that there's an underlying cryptocurrency tied to it. But what the other thing it allows you to do is track the ownership and authenticity. So essentially, you would be able to verify that the non-fungible token, this digital piece of art, a digital playing card, what have you, would be what it purports to be, right? Because I could theoretically just pull an image off the internet and say, oh, haha, this is an original Zach Pyers doodle, right? Um, but it might not be, right? Because the reality is that you might have trouble verifying it. What the non-fungible token does is it allows you to verify and say, yes, this was actually created by Zach. This was one of his doodles, and you could trace it back because the token, the non-fungible token nature of that allows for you to have essentially allows you to track it and verify that it is what it purports to be. Now, the kind of the interesting thing about these, well, there's a couple interesting things. Is one, the value of non-fungible tokens is similar to how we calculate the value of cryptocurrency. It's a scarcity issue, right? And it's frankly supply and demand. So non-fungible tokens are not, I wouldn't say are wildly different than, let's say, art pieces, like an original art piece. The difference is that they are sometimes much easier to create and can flood the market. So the prices for non-fungible tokens, when we were looking back into the pandemic or in the later parts of the pandemic, non-fungible tokens were everywhere. And it seemed as if people were releasing non-fungible tokens right and left and making plenty of money off of it. We've seen the value in general, this is a very general statement, the value of those non-fungible tokens declined significantly. And I think part of it is the fact that we've kind of moved to the point where there has been a flood of them and people have started to say, can I resell them? And sometimes the answer is yes. But what we're seeing more is they're just not holding their value in the market the way that they were when they were first released. The other interesting thing about them is that it also allows somebody to get a royalty every time the non-fungible token trades hands. So for example, if I create a non-fungible token and sell it to you, Kenton Steele, and then Kenton, I get the value of that. But as the creator, I can write into the code so that every time you may transfer it and sell the non-fungible token, I get a 5% commission. So when you sell it again to, let's say, John Doe, and you sell it for $100, I get 5% of that, or I get $5, and it's immediately transferred back to me. So it allows artists and the creators of these non-fungible tokens to essentially continue to earn or profit off of their work long into the future, which is different than, let's say, a starving artist, right, who may sell their early artwork for pennies because they're starving and they can't, earn a living off of it. But fast forward 30 years, they're later in their career, and now their early work is worth millions and millions of dollars. Well, they don't have any stake in that, right? They don't have any ownership interest in it. They've usually relinquished all of it. And so if the piece is resold, they're just out of luck. So that's one of the things that I think is kind of interesting or neat about this, is that it allows the artist to continue to profit from the work even as the time goes on.
That is very interesting. That concept of creating ownership and having a stake in a digital asset is certainly part of what's at the core of this discussion. And I think that kind of brings us to Bitcoin mining. What is Bitcoin mining? Where do Bitcoins come from?
Yeah, so this is, and what I will say is, when we talk about mining in general, it's not, you hear a lot about Bitcoin mining because it's the most, it's the largest, it's the oldest, it's got the biggest market cap. So there's a lot of, the conversation focuses around Bitcoin or Bitcoin mining, but other cryptocurrencies are mined too. So when we have this conversation, I want to make sure that we're not just limiting it, right, to Bitcoin. You need to be thinking of it in the context of, there's a whole host of other cryptocurrencies that utilize similar, and not just cryptocurrencies, but blockchain technology in general. So part of the way in which that we authenticate and prove that something is part of the blockchain is that we have to solve algorithms, right? There are sophisticated algorithms behind this technology that essentially allows the next piece of the chain to be built. And so theoretically, the chain is always being added to, and algorithms are always being solved by various computers that are part of the network. And so from the idea essentially is that by solving these algorithms, it helps to not only increase the blockchain so that more transactions can occur, because essentially every time a transaction occurs, it has to be recorded in the chain. So we have to keep solving the algorithms, which takes a huge amount of computer resources to do these problems. It's not, when you think about like when you think of a math problem, right? This is not like 4 times 8, is 32. We're talking about, complex math problems that really only a computer can solve in order to help verify the blockchain technology to build out the chain. And so this is also a decentralized process, which means anybody can be a part of the blockchain mining and part of the process. So in order to reward people who participate in this technology, every time a new chain is added, a new Bitcoin, essentially, I'm using this in, certain Bitcoin or amount of Bitcoin are created. And so what the miner's incentive is to put their computers into the process so that their computers can mine the Bitcoin, and then they're rewarded with more Bitcoin, right? And so that's how the Bitcoin gets mined in general, but also how these people essentially make a living sometimes just mining the Bitcoin.
Well, so we've covered a lot of ground, and I think that the sort of next logical place here, the next question is, there's obviously a lot of money involved in cryptocurrency, in NFT sales. And when we start talking about, transferring huge sums of money, these types of transactions we're discussing, it creates a question of who's in charge here, who is regulating and overseeing this process.
Yeah. So what we have seen, you and I have been talking about this on this podcast for practically 2 years at this point. But it seems like with the advent of almost every new technology, regulators are caught off guard. legislatures are caught off guard. And then there's kind of a scramble in order to determine, does this need regulated? Do we need laws around this? And how are we going to handle this new concept? And so when Bitcoin was first introduced, there really wasn't a lot of regulation. There really wasn't a lot of legislation. People really didn't know what it was, right? And some people thought the whole thing was a joke. I mean, I still can remember when Bitcoin was trading for less than $1. I really wish I would have invested, money at that point in time, but I didn't. But the reality is that we've seen, as time has gone on, we've seen more regulation. And so we've seen certain states step in and say, okay, we're going to start regulating this in some form or capacity. The reality is, though, is that because of the way that our financial systems work in the United States, state regulations, while they can be important, are not necessarily always as effective as, say, federal regulations. Because the reality is that, while states have the capacity and ability to regulate, financial transactions and issues within their state, so many of these transactions happen across, state lines, and frankly, some of them happen internationally, right, across country borders. So we've got some state regulators that are encouraging the use. We've got some state regulators that have discouraged the use of blockchain and cryptocurrency. And I will tell you that within the last, 2, 3, 4 years, we have seen an incredible increased push from federal regulation and legislation. And so we have seen the Treasury, we've seen the IRS step in and start to say, we want more information regarding all of your cryptocurrency transactions. For a long time, it was kind of the wild, wild west if you went to try to collect taxes on cryptocurrency trades, because people weren't keeping track of their basis, they weren't keeping track of how much they bought or they sold, and they were just pocketing the money. Well, you can have huge sums of money hitting your bank account because of these type of transactions. So we've seen the IRS, and the Treasury step in on some of these. The other area that we've now started to see is the Securities and Exchange Commission, right? Because what we have seen, especially as of late, and I know we'll discuss this in later podcasts, is we've seen issues where, some of these exchanges have failed. And then the question becomes not only regulation over the exchanges, but also regulation of the cryptocurrency in general. Is how is it being handled or regulated? Is it in fact a security, right? Some people in the industry have been pushing for years to have cryptocurrencies recognized as securities. Other people have said, absolutely not. These are not securities. These are something totally different. And so, we've seen this push to try to essentially to try to regulate it, especially as of late. The other thing that's been happening, and I'll just mention kind of here as the last point we close out, is we've started to see more litigation about this, right? Especially after kind of the boom from the pandemic, we've started to see exchanges, and we've started to see individual coins fail, right? Individual cryptocurrencies just fail. And so as that's happened, and every time, and I don't say every time, but oftentimes when a lot of investors lose money, they bring a lawsuit. And so we've started to see a lot of civil lawsuits about this point too, most of this litigation now is in the form of a class action or some sort of enforcement mechanism by the Securities and Exchange Commission. But we've started to see this rise too, kind of exponentially, simply because, we have, as of late, we've had a handful of these currencies significantly decreasing value, the exchanges collapse, and or the values of some of these coins just implode. So there's a lot of private civil litigation that's focused on this as well.
Well, thank you for all of that explanation. As you said, this is a topic we'll be exploring further, and what can go right, what can go wrong when we're talking about cryptocurrencies are some things we'll be exploring in later episodes. But thank you all for joining us for this edition of the Reminger Report podcast on emerging technologies. Please be sure to follow us wherever you get your podcasts, and stay tuned for more discussions on cryptocurrencies, NFTs, blockchain technologies, things in this space.